The radio test tone hit at exactly 600 am, a single clean note that usually meant another ordinary morning in a town that sold the idea of safety like fresh bread. But not today. Today that tone is going to end a lie 28 years old. If you're hearing my voice, breathe, keep your eyes on the road, and listen closely. Before the sun finishes climbing the bridgers, a knock at a green door on Willowbrook Drive will turn a church deacon into a suspect, and a hardware store into a crime scene. And if you care about cases where science finally speaks for the silenced, subscribe now and stay with me to the last second. Because when the cuffs click, the quiet breaks in a way you won't forget. Bozeman wakes the same way it always does, coffee machines sighing, dogs thumping tails against kitchen cabinets, tires whispering past snow-packed curbs. Detective Linda Carruthers sits in the passenger seat of an unmarked car, hands wrapped around a paper cup she isn't drinking, watching a house that looks like every postcard version of a good life. A porch light still on from the night before. A wreath that says welcome. In the driveway, a dusting of frost makes the Lexus and the faded Ford look like they were dipped in sugar. You don't expect history to pivot on a quiet street like this. But it does. Linda has been up since 4. Not from nerves exactly. She's done enough dawn warrants to put a calendar out of business. But because this one knots the stomach in a special way, on her lap is a folder rubbed soft at the corners from months of opening and closing. Inside a hair, a partial print, a map dotted with pins, a photocopy of a diner schedule from another century, and a name that until last summer never crossed her desk. It's a name half this town says with fondness and habit. The way you say the name of the man who knows where every bolt and washer lives without looking. The name is Thomas Bradley. The reason it's in the folder is not. In a different decade, when pay phones still swallowed quarters and radios still fizzed with static, a 19-year-old named Nora Mitchell vanished between the back door of a diner and the driver's seat of her red Civic. That's not supposed to be possible, not on a Tuesday in a town like this. But the Bridger Mountains are good at swallowing echoes. And if you've ever stood above a valley at 2 in the morning, you know how sound can fall straight down and never return. Search parties stretched themselves thin across sage and shale until hope turned to procedure and procedure turned to boxes with labels. People married, moved, had kids, changed jobs. Whole lives happened. The file waited. What changed isn't magic, it's patience meeting new tools. A lab with machines that can pull meaning out of one stubborn skin cell. An analyst who doesn't mind losing a weekend to a family tree that sprawls like cottonwood roots. A cup tossed in a public trash can, plucked and swabbed with the care you'd reserve for a confession. Then a number appears in a report that isn't poetry but reads like it. Probability so high it turns possibility into gravity. The hair from Nora's driver's seat and the coffee cup from a Tuesday afternoon speak the same language. They say the same person. Linda has read that line enough times to hear it when she closes her eyes. She's pictured the moment 1,000 ways. The door opens, the face tilts, the eyes widen or don't. She's told herself every version of what comes next, from chaos to cooperation. What she can't rehearse is the sound other lives make when the truth arrives. A wife who thinks the knock is about a porch light violation, a teenage son on the stairs, one barefoot, one socked, puzzled at uniforms in the foyer. Neighbors blinking through blinds, already filming before they understand what they're filming. A town about to see itself under an unkind high beam. Her phone buzzes once. Perimeter set. She nods to the driver. A breath goes in and out, shallow. The way breaths go when there's too much weight in the room and not enough air. The team moves like they're practicing for a test they've already passed. A hand lifts to the doorbell and presses. The chime answers cheerful and wrong. From inside, footsteps. A shadow. The frosted glass turns skin-colored for a second. The deadbolt snicks, the door swings. Margaret Bradley fills the doorway wearing a robe and the morning on her face. She's the kind of person who keeps a spare casserole in the freezer for a sick neighbor without thinking to mention it later. The kind of person who leaves chairs at the end of church rows for latecomers. Her first reaction is ordinary surprise, a question readying itself. But before she can speak, another frame appears behind her, larger, familiar to half the town. Thomas. He sees the badges, the gloves, the stance that says this is not about a fence permit. The corners of his eyes crinkle and then flatten. There's a tiny loosening around his mouth. Not confusion, recognition. You don't need a decade in interview rooms to catch it. You only need to be standing close enough to mistake it for something like relief. Detective Carruthers introduces herself, because names matter even when the moment is sharp enough to cut. She reads the words every cop memorizes before they truly understand them. Miranda sounds different in living rooms. The syllables hit carpet and bounce back soft but heavy. Margaret's hand goes to the edge of the door like she needs it to lean against. When Linda says the words, "The disappearance of Nora Mitchell," Margaret's chin trembles, but not with the particular tremor of someone blindsided by nonsense. It's the tremor of someone who doesn't understand and yet understands that she must. Up on the staircase, a teenage girl in an oversized sweatshirt appears, hair skewed, eyes moving fast between faces, assembling a picture that cannot be what it looks like and yet looks exactly like what it is. Thomas doesn't argue. He doesn't ask to see a warrant. He doesn't say this must be a mistake. He just asks, with voice level like it's a question about picking up a dry cleaning order, if he can put on pants and shoes. Linda nods because there are small dignities that cost nothing and sometimes buy you cooperation. She watches him cross the hallway and disappear toward the bedroom. As he goes, something else crosses her mind uninvited: the grainy volunteer photo from 1996. A line of people with day packs and walking sticks and bright orange vests spread across a slope of grass the color of old pennies. A man in the middle, head down, scanning the ground. You can't swear it's him from the distance and the angle. But if she had to lay money on it, she would. Margaret finds words during the seconds of waiting, and their shape is a plea. What is this? Why are you here? My husband sings in the choir. He fixes things at the church. Linda answers carefully because precision is part of kindness. She says there has been a development in an old case. She says she is sorry for the shock. She says they will have more to say later today. She doesn't say that the development is a single hair guarded by an envelope for a generation, a kindness of storage that kept truth from crumbling into dust. She doesn't say that sometimes the human body leaves a breadcrumb without knowing it, and sometimes time is generous enough to bring that breadcrumb forward whole. There will be a time to say those things. Not here. Not in front of the family photos lined on the mantel in careful decays, babies in pumpkin costumes, a middle school band uniform, a shot of Thomas standing with a ribbon at a charity 5K, all the visual grammar of a life presented to the world and believed. Thomas returns in jeans and a navy sweater, hands empty. The cuffs click in the space between two heartbeats. They are not loud. Handcuffs rarely are. The loud part is the intake of breath from the stairwell. The soft "oh" from Margaret, like a sound you make when a plate slips, and you know it will break before it breaks. The sudden knowledge that tomorrow will not look like yesterday ever again. Linda guides him toward the door. She is not thinking about the victory some people will imagine in this moment. She is thinking about chain of custody, about clean logs, about the long narrow bridge between an arrest and a conviction that dips and sways with every challenge the defense can throw. She is thinking about a father in a small apartment, whose spare bedroom walls are maps and faces and pins and notes, who has been waiting so long to sleep without the hum of questions. On the porch, the morning air is a hard bright cold. Somewhere a car remote chirps. The neighborhood begins to stir, blinds lifting, a coat thrown over pajamas. A neighbor whose lawn Thomas has mowed leans out to wave and then doesn't. Phones rise. Red recording dots glow. Linda feels the story pick up speed the way a sled does when it finds the path. You can't stop it now, you can only steer. The drive to the detention center is 12 minutes if you catch the lights. From the back seat, Thomas looks left and right like a man measuring distance. He doesn't speak. People think the guilty talk too much and the innocent talk a lot, but the truth is messier. Silence is a tool everyone uses when they're not sure whether sound will help or hurt. Linda glances at him once in the rear view and then stops herself. It isn't personal, she reminds the part of her that wants to assign story to every micro-expression. It's work. At intake, the routine swallows the drama. Paper forms, gloves snapping, pockets emptied onto a steel tray. The flash of a camera that washes all faces the same shade of tired. A deputy reads writes again, monotone. The machine hums as it rolls fingerprints into the record, adding ridges to a database that tries to make sense of the ways we are unique. On the bench outside the processing room, a TV tuned to morning news shows a live shot of Willowbrook Drive. A reporter talks with a voice that makes everything sound like a headline even when it's a sentence. The crawl at the bottom of the screen leaves not nearly enough room for the words 28 years. Linda signs another form and another, initials a property sheet, hands over a sealed envelope with a warrant that has the exact dates and the exact rooms that teams are already meticulously stepping through with cameras and tweezers, pulling threads that may or may not tie. She thinks of the folder in her lap 2 hours earlier and how thin it is compared with what it carries. Evidence never looks like the weight it has. Outside, the sky has shifted from the pink of a promise to the pale certainty of day. Traffic has thickened. The town is fully awake now and the story is running like current through every text thread and job site radio. People will say the words "I can't believe" and the words "I always wondered," and both will be partly true and partly self-protection. By noon someone will post a photo from a church potluck where Thomas is in the second row wearing an apron, and a smile and comments will stack under it like bricks, building and building. Someone will knock on a door 2 streets over to ask Margaret if she needs groceries, and she will start to answer yes, and then realize she has no idea what food tastes like anymore. This is what an arrest does in a town this size. It remaps the ordinary. If you've stayed with me this far, keep listening. Turn on notifications. This is only the first 60 minutes of a day that will rewind 30 Octobers and ask hard questions about how predators hide and how communities help them without meaning to. We're going to walk the distance from a diner's back door to a mountain turnout. We're going to open boxes that smell like paper and winter. We're going to follow a hair under a microscope until it becomes a line between 2 names that have never shared a sentence before. And by the end, whether you wanted to or not, you'll know what it sounds like when the past decides it's done being quiet. The Bridger Mountains hold secrets the way winter holds its breath. Tight, silent, waiting. If you stand on the canyon road after dark, you can almost hear them, folded into the rush of pine needles and the quiet press of snow. That was the backdrop on October 23, 1996, when a 19-year-old girl named Nora Mitchell disappeared between one heartbeat and the next. A diner light switched off, a key turned in a lock, a car vanished into the night. No scream, no struggle anyone could hear. Just absence, clean, sharp, absolute. And if you've ever lost something precious in a place you thought was safe, you know the gut, deep horror of realizing that safe is a story we tell ourselves until it breaks. Stay with me. Because in this chapter we go back to that night minute by minute, until the silence itself feels like evidence. Nora was the kind of girl who lived in 2 futures at once. To her friends at Montana State, she was the dreamer who talked about journalism, the big city, the kind of career where your name rides the byline above the fold. To her parents, she was still the child who left handwritten notes on the kitchen counter if she ran late, a girl who never forgot to call her grandmother on Sundays. That Tuesday she tied her apron, tucked her hair under a headband, and worked her shift at Rusty's Diner like she always did. Meatloaf and mashed potatoes, refilled coffee cups, a smile when Eddie, the cook, cracked one of his half-jokes, half-philosophies about how a diner is a town's diary, every booth another page. Routine, familiar, the kind of night that doesn't make the news until it does. By 9:30, Eddie left through the back door, calling goodbye. Nora's purse still sat on the counter. Her jacket hung near the door. She said she'd see him later and maybe she believed it. Maybe she thought she had time. Outside, her red Honda Civic waited in the back lot, the kind of car that never turned heads but always started on the second crank. Somewhere between Eddie's taillights vanishing down North 7th Avenue, and the moment her best friend Jennifer sat alone at the rocking R bar, Wondering why Nora hadn't shown for trivia night, something happened. Something so fast, so quiet, so clean that for decades the only proof it happened at all was the absence of Nora herself. Her father, Robert Mitchell, was the first to know something was wrong. By 1100, he was in the diner lot, staring at his daughter's purse in his hands and the empty space where her Honda should have been. Picture it. A man holding the last ordinary object his daughter touched, listening to the neon hum of a sign above a locked door, knowing in his bones what the paperwork would take months to admit. The deputy who answered his call logged the scene as unusual. That was an understatement. No broken glass, no forced entry. Just the ghost of movement in a place that should have been safe. At 100 am, a hunter found the Honda, parked like it belonged there, on a scenic turnout off Bridger Canyon Road. Driver's door cracked open, keys still in the ignition, backpack on the passenger seat with textbooks and a half-written letter inside. The car looked like it was waiting for someone to return any minute. But Nora didn't. The search began with flashlights and dogs and voices calling her name into the vast Montana dark. If you've never heard hundreds of strangers call a single name into the night, you can't know the way hope sounds when it tries to fill mountains. That hope cracked with every unanswered echo. Daylight brought the town. 300 people by sunrise, ranchers, students, parents, pastors, all combing through brush ravines and creek beds. Some carried sandwiches, some carried maps, all carried the belief that a missing girl could be found if enough eyes looked hard enough. But the mountains gave back nothing. Not a footprint, not a scrap of fabric, not even the sound of struggle. Just silence, heavy and endless, like the land itself had swallowed her. For weeks, the search expanded. Helicopters circled. Bloodhounds lost the trail at the parking lot, as if Nora had simply dissolved into air. Theories multiplied. Hitchhiker picked her up. Stranger followed her from the diner. Someone she knew lured her out. Every tip was written down, investigated, crossed off. Every call to the sheriff's office started the same way. I think I saw, and ended the same way. We'll look into it. The maps filled with colored pins until they looked like someone had tried to stitch a wound shut with thread too thin. And through it all, Robert Mitchell transformed, a father turned investigator turned archivist of his own pain. He papered a spare bedroom with maps, photos, and timelines. He made calls at midnight. He drove highways chasing rumors. He aged 10 years in 6 months. His wife Patricia tried to keep life steady, but their home became a war room where hope was a discipline, not a feeling. Robert once said in an interview, "You don't stop looking until someone proves she's gone. And even then you don't stop." That sentence carried him through decades. Decades where leads froze, detectives rotated, and the file grew heavier while answers remained light as air. By the time the 20th anniversary of Nora's disappearance arrived, the story was less a headline than a ghost story told in Bozeman kitchens. Parents warned daughters about working late shifts alone. Volunteers remembered searching shoulder to shoulder with neighbors who are now gray-haired. The girl in the red Civic became part of local folklore, a reminder that safety is fragile and predators don't always look like shadows. They look like neighbors. They look like men who sing in choirs, coach Little League, and shake your hand at the hardware store. But no one knew that in 1996. Not yet. If you're still here, hit subscribe, because the silence doesn't last forever. In the next chapter, science cracks open what memory and manpower couldn't. DNA, family trees, and a coffee cup tossed away after a casual sip pull a 30-year-old ghost back into the light. What begins with a hair on a driver's seat ends with a name no one ever expected. And that's where the story tilts from mystery to revelation. The year was 2023 when the silence around Nora Mitchell's disappearance finally began to fracture. For 27 years, her case file sat in the Gallatin County Sheriff's Department like a tombstone, thick, heavy, and collecting dust. Hundreds of pages, maps with faded pins, witness statements that had been read and reread so many times their ink had started to blur. Detectives had come and gone, each one leaving behind a note of frustration in the margins. No further leads. But Detective Linda Carruthers, new to the cold case unit, saw the file differently. She saw it as a door that hadn't been kicked hard enough. Carothers had grown up in Montana, the kind of childhood where the mountains were both playground and teacher. By the time she joined law enforcement, she understood two things better than most: mountains don't give up their secrets easily, and silence is never the whole story. In January 2023, when she opened the Nora Mitchell file for the first time, she wasn't looking for miracles. She was looking for science. And science, unlike memory, doesn't forget. In the evidence locker, 3 items had survived time's erosion. A hair follicle pulled from the driver's seat of Nora's Honda. A partial fingerprint smudged on the rearview mirror, and faint biological material on the steering wheel. 2 degraded in 1996 to test, but still preserved in plastic bags that had been sealed with the hope that one day, technology might catch up. Carothers held those bags in her hands, and thought about the father who had begged detectives for decades not to throw anything away. His obsession had preserved a chance. The sample was sent to Orchid Cellmark in Dallas, a lab with a reputation for squeezing whispers out of silence. Weeks turned into months. Then one spring afternoon, Carothers received the email that made her pulse race partial DNA profile extracted. Clear enough to search. The probability of a match wasn't guaranteed, but it was possible, more possible than it had ever been. The first sweep through CODIS, the federal DNA database, came back empty. No matches among millions of convicted offenders. That result crushed some detectives, but Carothers saw an opening. CODIS wasn't the end, it was the beginning. The real weapon of 2023 wasn't a database of criminals. It was investigative genealogy, the same method that had unmasked the Golden State Killer, the same method that turned family trees into nets for ghosts. The DNA went to Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia, where specialists uploaded the genetic code into public ancestry databases. From there, genealogists worked like cartographers of bloodlines, tracing distant cousins, mapping family branches, and narrowing the possibilities. Imagine a detective holding a family tree the size of Montana, trimming branches until only a handful of names remain. That was the process. That was the moment Nora's case shifted from memory to mathematics. By August 2023, Parabon sent back their breakthrough: a relative, a fourth cousin who had uploaded DNA to GEDmatch for a family history project. That single upload became a thread, and when pulled, it unraveled a line that led straight into Bozeman. At the center of that line was a man named Thomas Bradley. On paper, Bradley was unremarkable: a hardware store owner, a church deacon, a father, 51 years old, living on Willowbrook Drive in the same house for nearly 2 decades. No arrests, no criminal history, no whispers of scandal. In fact, he was the kind of man people trusted. Trusted with their tools, their houses, their children. He was the man who organized block parties and lent his truck to neighbors. The man who remembered your dog's name. The man you waved to without thinking twice. But in the evidence folder, his name was radioactive. DNA pulled from a hair in Nora's car matched DNA from Bradley's discarded coffee cup, retrieved by investigators who had followed him to a Starbucks on North 19th Avenue. The lab confirmed what Carothers had already felt in her bones: the probability of that match being coincidence was less than 1 in several billion. Still, DNA alone was a knife without a handle. It could cut, but it couldn't be wielded without care. The prosecution would demand motive, opportunity, a chain of evidence strong enough to hold the weight of 27 years of silence. And Carothers knew Bradley wasn't just some faceless suspect. He was Bozeman. He was Sunday Choir. He was Little League. He was the last man anyone wanted to picture behind the word murderer. So the surveillance began: quiet, relentless. Officers borrowed from neighboring counties rotated shifts, watching Bradley open his store at 7:30 every morning with the same key sequence. Watching him eat his sandwich at 12:15 in the back room. Watching him attend church, chat with neighbors, shovel sidewalks, smile at strangers. He seemed normal, eerily normal, too normal. And that, in its own way, was the loudest alarm bell of all. Because predators don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes they hide in the role of the man who helps. The man who stays late. The man who volunteers. When detectives finally searched Bradley's house, what they found wasn't blood or weapons or trophies. What they found was stranger, quieter, more disturbing. A folder of newspaper clippings yellowed with age, filled with missing person stories from across the West. articles about women gone without a trace. Some highlighted, some annotated in Bradley's neat handwriting, and 3 about Nora Mitchell, more heavily marked than the rest. That was the moment the case cracked open. Not with a scream, but with a whisper of obsession. A whisper that had been sitting in a bedroom closet for nearly 3 decades, waiting for the day science would catch up and expose it. This wasn't just about a girl who vanished in 1996 anymore. This was about trust. About a town that prided itself on knowing everyone's business, realizing it had never really known one of its own. And if you think this story has reached its darkest moment, stay, because in the next chapter that darkness begins to take shape. The arrest came quietly, almost too quietly for the weight it carried. On September 14, 2023, a pair of unmarked SUVs rolled down Willowbrook Drive just as the sun tipped over the Bridger Range, painting the sky with a false calm. Neighbors stepped onto porches with coffee mugs, unaware that the man they trusted to lend them a screwdriver or help unload firewood was about to be unmasked as the suspect in a murder that had haunted their community for 27 years. Detectives didn't storm the house. They didn't need to. Thomas Bradley stepped outside with his Labrador on a leash, dressed in his church polo, ready for another ordinary day. He didn't resist when they called his name. He didn't ask why when the cuffs clicked around his wrists. He just lowered his eyes, as if the world had finally caught up to a secret he had been waiting too long to keep. Word traveled through Bozeman faster than the official press release ever could. Phones buzzed. Coffee shops went silent. At the high school, teachers whispered in hallways while students scrolled through headlines that looked too surreal to be real. Local hardware store owner arrested in 1996 murder of Nora Mitchell. Some shook their heads, others muttered, "No way." But by noon, disbelief was cracking under the weight of fact. Inside the interrogation room, Bradley sat at the end of a metal table, his wrists cuffed, his expression calm. Detectives laid out the evidence. DNA from the coffee cup, DNA from the hair in Nora's car, the genealogical tree that pointed straight to him. Each piece landed like a hammer, but Bradley didn't flinch. His only words at first were simple. "You've got it wrong." He repeated it like a prayer steady practiced, as if denial had become a reflex. But detectives knew better. They leaned on the silences, let the weight of the years fill the room until even Bradley had to feel the walls closing in. When they showed him the folder of clippings, his mask slipped for the first time, his jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed, not in confusion but in calculation. It wasn't the reaction of an innocent man blindsided by accusation. It was the reaction of someone realizing the quiet life he had built was about to collapse brick by brick. Back in 1996, investigators had knocked on Bradley's door like they had with dozens of others. He had been cooperative, polite, even helpful. He'd joined the volunteer search parties, combed the fields, shaken hands with Nora's grieving father. He'd stood shoulder to shoulder with neighbors holding candles at vigils. In every photograph there he was, a face in the crowd, lit by flame and trust. And maybe that had been his greatest disguise, hiding not in the shadows but in plain sight, as part of the very community that mourned the girl he had taken. When prosecutors announced the charges, the courtroom filled beyond capacity. Journalists packed the benches. True crime podcasters with handheld recorders elbowed for space. Families of other unsolved victims came too, watching with wide, cautious eyes, wondering if Bradley's arrest might be a key to cases beyond Nora's. And in the front row sat Nora's parents, older now, faces carved by decades of waiting. For them, this wasn't just a trial. It was the exhale of a breath they had held since the night their daughter vanished. The evidence was laid out with surgical precision. DNA probability charts, ballistic patterns, the annotated clippings, testimonies from genealogists who explained how a distant cousin's hobby had brought down a man hiding in their own neighborhood. The defense tried to poke holes, called the DNA degraded, argued contamination. But every time they did, prosecutors came back with clarity, with science that spoke louder than speculation. And then came the detail that froze the room. Detectives had uncovered a receipt from 1996 for rope and duct tape, purchased at a hardware store. Not just any hardware store, Bradley's. The receipt bore his employee ID, Timestamped just 2 days before Nora vanished. Neighbors who had once defended him now sat in the gallery, eyes wet, heads lowered. The man they had trusted to host block parties, the man who had baptized their children, the man they thought they knew, was painted in testimony as a predator who had hidden in plain sight for nearly 3 decades. When Bradley finally spoke on the stand, his voice carried none of the calm confidence he had shown at his arrest. He stammered, shifted, contradicted himself. He denied knowing Nora, then admitted he had seen her around. He denied ever entering her car, then was shown the DNA report that made denial impossible. His mask cracked in front of everyone, and what lay beneath was emptiness, a hollow man who had built his life on lies and ordinary gestures. The jury deliberated less than 6 hours. When they returned, the word "guilty" rang through the courtroom like a bell tolling for the entire town. Nora's parents wept. Reporters rushed to file their stories, and for the first time in 27 years, the people of Bozeman believed the word justice might actually apply to their darkest chapter. But justice, as the town would soon learn, isn't a clean cut. It leaves scars. Bradley's arrest didn't just close a case. It opened wounds that would take years to heal. Neighbors questioned themselves. How had they missed the signs? Parents wondered how many other predators hid behind familiar faces. And the police department, once criticized for its failures, now wrestled with a darker truth. Sometimes the monster isn't out there. Sometimes it's sitting beside you at church. And for Detective Carruthers, standing in the back of the courtroom, the verdict was both victory and burden. She had given Nora's family an answer, but she had also shown Bozeman that their trust had been misplaced for decades. In her notebook, she wrote 6 words, but it also scars. That was the legacy of the case, not just the guilty verdict, not just the DNA match, but the reminder that safety is fragile, trust is dangerous, and monsters sometimes smile when they shake your hand. The town didn't erupt in celebration when the gavel fell. There were no parades, no cheering crowds, no fireworks. What came instead was something quieter, heavier, a release of tension that had been wound so tightly for 27 years it almost didn't know how to let go. People in Bozeman went home that night not with joy, but with a strange emptiness. The kind that comes when the story you've been telling yourself for decades finally ends and you're not sure what comes next. For Nora's parents, the verdict was a double-edged sword. On one hand, they finally had a name, a face, a man who would never walk free again. On the other, the reality hit like fresh grief. Their daughter was still gone, her laughter still only alive in memory. Justice had given them closure, but closure was not the same as healing. Healing, they realized, would be their responsibility, and it would never be complete. Detective Carruthers stood outside the courthouse in the chill evening air, reporters buzzing around her like wasps. She answered questions with careful precision, repeating the words, persistence, DNA, and justice, as if they were talismans against the chaos of microphones and flashing cameras. But when the lights dimmed and the crowd dispersed, she allowed herself one moment of raw honesty. She sat in her car, hands gripping the steering wheel, and whispered to the empty passenger seat, "We did it, Nora." Then, for the first time in years, she let herself cry. Across town, neighbors struggled with their own reckonings. For some, Bradley's guilt was a relief. It proved that the nightmare had a name, that the shadow wasn't endless. For others, it was a betrayal that cut deeper than the crime itself. They had trusted him. They had invited him into their homes, eaten at his table, prayed beside him in church pews. To discover that all of those moments were tainted, staged, calculated, it left them reeling. The hardware store closed its doors for good, its windows dark, its shelves stripped bare. The sign that once carried Bradley's name was torn down in the night, not by officials, but by townspeople who couldn't bear to see it anymore. For weeks afterward, people crossed the street rather than walk past the building, as though the bricks themselves had absorbed something rotten. In the police department, new policies took root. Evidence handling protocols became airtight. DNA collection became standard even in minor cases. Officers received training in genealogy and forensic advancements. Carruthers pushed for transparency, Quarterly community meetings, open case reviews, a direct line between detectives and residents. She knew trust, once broken, was fragile, but she believed it could be rebuilt if handled like glass, carefully, slowly, deliberately. The story of Nora's case spread beyond Bozeman. National outlets covered the trial, documentaries pitched episodes, podcasts dissected the timeline, the DNA, the decades of silence in law enforcement circles. The case became a teaching tool, a reminder that persistence and science could crack even the coldest files. In classrooms, instructors pointed to Carruthers and her team as proof that justice delayed doesn't always mean justice denied. But for the people who had lived it, the lessons were more personal. Parents became more vigilant. Teenagers were warned never to walk home alone. The old habit of unlocked doors died for good. And yet, in the midst of that caution, there was also resilience. The town held a candlelight vigil not for the killer who had hidden among them, but for the girl whose absence had shaped a generation. On a crisp October evening, 27 years after Nora disappeared, people gathered at the edge of the field where her bicycle had been found. There were no reporters, no microphones, no cameras, just neighbors, friends, and family holding candles against the wind. Nora's father, his hair now silver, spoke in a voice that trembled but did not break. "She deserved better," he said simply. "And though we can never bring her back, we can make sure her story doesn't disappear again." As the candles flickered, Carruthers stood in the crowd listening. She realized then that closure wasn't an ending. It was a doorway. The case had been solved, but the work of protecting, remembering, and healing had only begun. In her office later that night, she opened the file one last time. The photographs, the reports, the notes written in the margins. She placed them back into the box, closed the lid, and slid it onto the shelf marked, "Closed." For a moment she stared at the word. It didn't feel final, but it felt right. The case was no longer unsolved. Justice had been served. That was enough. Outside, the radio crackled in her patrol car as she drove through the quiet streets of Bozeman. She thought about Jack Walsh, the Nebraska detective whose story she'd once studied in academy training. She thought about Nora Mitchell, whose laughter still echoed faintly in the town she left behind. And she thought about all the other cold cases still waiting in their cardboard boxes, gathering dust, holding truths not yet uncovered. She tightened her grip on the wheel, knowing this wasn't the last. But for tonight, at least, one family could sleep with answers instead of questions. And in a town that had carried shadows for nearly 3 decades, the first light of healing had finally begun to shine.